Welcome, Sam. It's a big pleasure to have you on. I've been looking forward to have a bit of a chat with you about all things training and all the research and everything that you have been doing and the collaborations that you are adding to the world of fitness and the training industry, because there's a lot of information out there, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of claims and things that are coming out on a daily basis from quote unquote fitness influencers that want to say things that probably are not as accurate, or they're misinterpreting the data correctly. So I have you here just to tell everything that is the right way, and truly understand a little bit more about some of these areas that have brought a lot of confusion lately. So before even we start, talk to me about your background. You have over 118 publications across the board with your research, and like you're so knowledgeable. Talk to me about you. So what made you go to this area of research? Why training? Why all these different areas of publication that you have dedicated these few years on this? Talk to me.
When I was going through school, particularly in high school, I started lifting weights and I really enjoyed it. And it came time to pick a college degree. And there was this, when you went through the categories, there's one called athletic training. And I said, well, that sounds cool. I want to train athletes. Little did I know that athletic training was actually treating injuries. But that's what my original degree was. And fast forward, I start getting educated in an exercise science type program, and I find out that research is a thing, like a thing that you can do. At the time, I had no interest. I eventually got a master's degree in exercise physiology, and I think at that time I really thought I was going to be a strength coach. So I had gotten some exposure in the strength and conditioning industry, and um, I liked working with athletes as a coach. And I think towards the tail end of my internships in strength and conditioning, I just realized my personality wasn't really a great fit. If you've ever been to a strength and conditioning facility, it's just a lot of cursing and like a lot of intensity, and that's pretty much the opposite of my personality. So I started doing a lot of testing in like a body composition lab at Florida Atlantic University. And my mentor at the time, Dr. Sue Graves, she was the chair of the department. She started saying, you should think about research. And I still had like such little interest, but I eventually went to a conference and I heard some researchers speak, and I'm like, this is kind of cool. And I think I might be able to do this. Um, so that started my journey to a PhD. So I started my PhD at University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and I was studying supplements. So I was actually funded, I believe, by GNC. It's been a long time. I quit my first PhD, which is such a scary thing to do. I quit my PhD and I found myself back in Fort Lauderdale, where I grew up, working at Starbucks and trying to figure out the next step in my life. And then I got in touch with Jeremy Lenicky, who was my mentor at University of Mississippi, and I went on to get my PhD there, where we kind of specialized in something called blood flow restriction. So we did a lot of BFR research. And ultimately, that's where I honed my skills in ultrasound. So I learned how to use ultrasound, which is the tool that I currently use in my lab here at the University of South Florida to better understand skeletal muscle growth adaptations to resistance training. So I guess that's the quick story of how I ended up here at USF.
Awesome. And what are you most passionate about in this area of research?
Um, I guess this changes with the ebbs and flows of what's going on, but currently I'm really interested in the interaction of resistance training volume and muscle growth adaptations. We have a study that it's ongoing. We're about halfway through with that study. I'm really interested in that, and I think I'm really interested in refining our ability to read a paper and understand, you know, how compelling is the evidence provided in this paper. For example, if you read a study and group A was better than group B, but the difference between the groups is so small, is it meaningful? And how much weight can we put in this evidence? So I think to help with that understanding, I've done a lot of work with just muscle imaging and trying to refine my skills of muscle imaging. But I think the thing that probably gets me up in the morning currently is just refining our understanding of resistance training volume. And how many sets do you need to do? How many weekly sets is necessary to maximize a muscle growth adaptation?
I am so interested in hearing more about that in a second, but what do you feel is the hardest when it comes to leading a study? So is it the design, is it execution, is it analysis of results, or the actual publication itself?
Um, Also a great question. Uh, this one's tough for me because I'm kind of strange, I guess. I enjoy every single part of it. Um, like writing, I truly love writing. It's I think a passion of mine. The coming up with the idea part is I actually gave a talk this summer at a conference. I was invited to speak, and um, I gave a talk on becoming an independent scientist. And you know, because you go from student to researcher, and how do you know if you have a good idea? That was kind of the title of the talk was becoming an independent scientist. Are my ideas any good? And I kind of told this story that since I've had this job and I'm going on my seventh year, I've never struggled to have an idea. And I didn't think it was going to be that way. I just, conversations with my students, we always realize, hey, we need to run this study because this is really important to know. So it's been really fascinating to me that the questions, I'm sorry about all these dings, my emails are popping up here. But we, the questions have always just come naturally from conversations because when you're reading constantly, and you're engaged in, what the field is currently doing, you're just flooded with questions. If I had to pin one thing that's maybe the most frustrating, maybe the statistical analysis. Um, I'm I, I appreciate stats, and I have a decent understanding of stats, but I'm no statistician. So there's one area I think I could improve, it would be there. Um, but overall, from the inception to the execution of the study to the writing, I love every part of it.
Amongst the type of studies, what is your favorite one? Do you like more like randomized controlled trials? Is more the cohort studies, crossover studies? Do you like more the meta-analyses or like research reviews, case studies? What is your most favorite and the least favorite ones?
My two favorite would be, I guess, randomized controlled trials. So we run a lot of interventions in my lab where we typically compare two different types of training to, and then have a control group as well. Um, and those are powerful, right? Because if you do them well, you can answer a question that's important to you. So those probably rank up there. And I was actually having a conversation with my partner recently, and I think my favorite, honestly, are just my idea papers. And and when you go through my publications, a lot of my papers are just an idea or a critique or a critical evaluation of a way that we think. And those to me are kind of the most fun. And I was telling a student because my student was working on one of these, and I think um it was maybe it's a long muscle length review that we recently wrote, or we wrote a review on does fatigue accumulate with resistance training? And these are ideas, and turning an idea into a paper without data is like a unique challenge because you have to create something out of nothing. You have to um, figure out, okay, how can I tell this story in a way that it makes sense? And how do I need to organize things? So I like idea papers, like narrative reviews, randomized control trials. And then I think for me, the least exciting is a meta-analysis. And meta-analyses are there's, I think they're difficult to do, but I also think um, that like there's a meta-analysis that just came out on rest periods, and I was reading this paper, and this paper carries really far, but any review or meta-analysis is only as good as the studies that go into it. And this paper ultimately concluded, for example, that you should rest more than a minute. And I read this paper, I looked at the studies that went into it, and I said that absolutely it doesn't make any sense, and it lacks nuance, because we know that you can rest 30 seconds if you're training with a low load. So meta-analyses, like I read them all the time, and I find myself just looking up every paper in that meta-analysis and seeing, okay, what did this paper find? What did this paper find? And I struggle with those just because um, it relies on what goes in to give you this output to try to draw a conclusion, and I struggle with that.
Now that you mentioned something about high loads and low loads, I actually do have a question about that. So when it comes to strength, is it better low loads or high loads? What are the strategies for someone who can truly access a gym or lack on like variety of resources, equipment, machines to be able to produce that amount of intensity and volume in order to get the outcome of, well, we could say strength, but we could also talk about hypertrophy.
We've done a lot of low load training studies and low load BFR as well. And typically we compare them to a control group, and our control group is most often a high load training group training at around 70% of 1RM. And when I say low loads, I would typically assume that's around 30% of 1RM to 40% of 1RM. And very consistently, we observe similar muscle growth adaptations. So muscle growth, time and time again, it's been shown multiple times. Muscle growth is going to be similar, but excuse me, the strength adaptations um, are almost always superior in the group that lifted heavy. So low load training and all these alternatives to traditional high load training are very effective ways to grow a muscle. But interestingly, they're not effective ways to make you stronger. And, it's probably 5 or 6 years ago now. That led to us, we actually wrote a paper called The Problem of Muscle Hypertrophy. And the idea here was, okay, why are our muscles growing, but people aren't getting stronger? I thought a larger muscle or a muscle that's grown, that's a mechanism for strength adaptation. And what we've come to understand is that that relationship isn't as perfect as everyone thinks that it is. So, when you train and you maximize muscle growth, typically protocols that maximize muscle growth are not going to maximize your strength adaptations, which is kind of interesting, I think. And, we got some pushback when we wrote these papers, and the pushback was, well, if you've grown your muscle, maybe it's through low load training or high load training, even if that strength isn't apparent, your strength potential or your potential to be stronger is now there. So what that would imply is that regardless of how you got your muscle bigger or made your muscles grow, now that your muscles have grown, you can now start training for strength and your strength ceiling is higher. Um, I don't know that I necessarily subscribe to that because it's very difficult to actually demonstrate that through study design. And we've tried more than once at this point. Um, so it leads me to think that it's very difficult to predict the strength adaptation based on a muscle growth adaptation. There's potential that there's some relationship there, but at least in my opinion, the nature of that relationship and the strength of that relationship is something that science is still trying to answer.
Could you say that this likelihood to see someone that doesn't appear to be strong, like it's not big, not muscular, but they could be stronger than someone who has a lot more muscle? Visually, they look big, shredded, like super muscular, but
Mhm.
they are not necessarily strong compared to someone who doesn't appear to be strong. They don't have that much muscle, like, or they don't look like they lift. but they may be stronger for some reason because of their lifestyle, because of the things that they're lifting. I don't know. Do you think that is potentially true?
I think there's definitely instances where the person with the smaller muscle could certainly be stronger than a person with a larger muscle. Um, in general, there's a relationship between the baseline size of a muscle and strength. So, for example, if you take 100 people and you measure the muscles, in general, but not always, the people with the larger muscles will be stronger. And the people in general with the smaller muscles will be weaker. What's interesting though is if you take two people and let's say they have the same strength and same muscle size, right? Person A and person B, they look very similar. They have similar characteristics. And you train both of those individuals. And I think people have probably experienced this. So both individuals start training. Person A could grow a lot, and person B may not grow as much. But person B, even though they didn't grow as much, it's very possible that their strength increased more than person A. So this is what I mean with the change from training is less predictive. The baseline characteristics are more reflective. I think of so for again for this example of muscle size and strength, but how much you grow in response won't predict how strong you get, and vice versa. So, I think a lot of people can relate. They're going to the gym with their friends, and someone might say, "Well, we've trained the same, but they've grown a lot. I haven't grown at all." Right? And they might also say, "Oh, we've done the same program. Why am I getting stronger and their weights haven't moved up that much?" So I think that shows that disassociation, or that non-perfect relationship between those changes. So it's very difficult to predict your progress in one based on progress in another. And for me, this is interesting because um, when I was a freshman, sophomore, and undergraduate, one of the ways that I gauged my progress, because you don't know if you're growing, right? If you do an 8-week, 12-week training block and you want to grow, the way I gauged it is, am I getting stronger? And if I got stronger, the assumption that I assumed to be true is I must have gotten bigger because I learned in school that the first 3 or 4 weeks of training, you get stronger via a neural adaptation. And then everything after that I learned is muscle growth. So long-term strength gains are attributed to muscle growth. But we now know that that's probably not true. It doesn't mean that some of the reason you're getting stronger couldn't be growth. It could be. But we also know that there seems to be more long-term neural adaptations and then perhaps other local adaptations taking place at the muscle that can make you stronger independent of a change in muscle size, which I just find extremely fascinating.
When you refer to, I guess, being strong and all the things related to strength, what is the biggest driver for strength?
That's a great question.
I guess compared to hypertrophy, like there must be a different driver that makes the muscles grow versus what
Yeah.
makes a muscle stronger.
So again, I think the baseline size of a muscle has a very strong relationship with the strength of the muscle. So your starting point, um, I think largely dictates your strength. But then adaptation wise, um, you know, we 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 know that there's neural adaptations that are occurring, and in research, this is often measured as you'll see it pop up as something called voluntary activation. So voluntary activation increases, and this is thought of more as an early adaptation to training. So when you begin training, your muscles organize into motor units. And the suggestion here is certain motor units activate certain fibers, and you can't necessarily access all of those at the beginning of a training program. So you can't voluntarily activate all of your motor units. And then as you train, you get better at doing this. So your strength is going to increase. There's other neural adaptations, increases in firing rate. Um, and classically in a textbook, you'll see the neural adaptations listed as increases in firing rate, and motor unit activation. So these would be classified under a neural adaptation. And then aside from that, the other mechanism that's most commonly suggested is increases in muscle fiber size. So your muscle is actually getting bigger. But again, um, these are speculated, and the neural adaptations we have some grip on. The muscle growth adaptations and the relationship with the strength adaptation is just, I think, more poorly understood. It's probably playing a role. I can't say how great of a role and the nature of that relationship, but probably on some level, adding sarcomeres. So sarcomeres make up something called a myofibril. A myofibril, a bunch of those make up muscle fibers. Muscle fibers make up fascicles, and then fascicles make up your muscle. So if you add contractile proteins, it does make sense that can and would most likely contribute to strength. And then increasing your ability to just activate those fibers as well. Um, I've heard other potential mechanisms thrown around, such as calcium kinetics. In the heart, your stroke volume is increased through increased release of calcium. So I think on some level this is another potential candidate for strength. Um, but again, I don't think we perfectly understand everything that contributes.
I guess I'm also interested in hearing from you in terms of hypertrophy. What is the biggest driver for hypertrophy? Is it the volume? Is it the intensity, the effort applied, all of them? What's the biggest contributor to hypertrophy?
I think most people have probably heard that the mechanisms you hear thrown around for muscle hypertrophy are mechanical tension, muscle damage, and metabolic contributions, and I believe most people would kind of lean towards mechanical tension seems to be a very important factor. And interestingly, that tension can be external or internal. So if you flex your muscle, like your posing practice, we actually did a study on this, that can grow your muscle if it's done with a sufficient amount of volume and intensity, meaning you need to have a fatigue element there. So it has to be of relatively high effort with some amount of fatigue. Um, so contracting the muscle, activating the muscle, activates the fibers, and then once you seem to fatigue those fibers, they're signaled to grow. And if you don't have a heavy weight or a heavy external load, then you have to just do more reps, and you can kind of reach that same endpoint of activating and fatiguing all of the fibers in a muscle. And there's a lot of discussion around volume because what people are really interested in is, well, there seems to be a relationship between volume and muscle growth. Um, and if there is, if we do more volume, we should be able to get more growth, right? But when I talk to people, I say it's not about um, doing more volume. It's about doing the amount of volume that's going to maximize your signaling potential in your fibers, because certainly that's not an infinite relationship. And certainly you reach a point where doing another set will not provide more growth. And I seem to believe that somewhere around sets 3 or 4, you're not going to get anything more out of it. Um, on an exercise. So when you're training and doing a muscle group, you do an exercise after 3 or 4 sets, it's time to move on to the next exercise. Now, that next exercise might train the same muscle, but it's training that muscle in a slightly different way, which might stimulate growth in a different aspect of that muscle. And this is where research really falls short because I mean, if you type in muscle volume and hypertrophy, you can find 100 podcasts. 10 of them are recorded this week. I mean, just people love talking about this topic. But the research, it really, for me, it doesn't move the needle because people are looking at volume and studying volume. And the way they do it in research is they just increase the number of sets. You know, you'll see studies doing 6, 7, 8, 9 sets of an exercise in a single training session. And it's like, at a certain point, you stopped increasing muscle protein synthesis and it's plateaued, and now you're just delaying recovery. Studies lack the variety of exercise that would be necessary to really push those volume limits, I think.
In order to improve that quality volume, would be about increasing the number of exercises that tackle the same muscle, perhaps, but just in a different angle, just a different stimuli, same muscle, but just different angles. What do you suggest, like in terms of volume and quality volume, rather than
Yeah.
just a lot of volume?
So let me provide an example. Let's say you're going to do 6 sets of chest, right? So when you read research, the participants would come in and do 6 sets of bench press. Now, I believe, based on what I read and what I understand, is that after your third set of bench press, you've maximized muscle protein synthesis in the fibers involved in that movement. So, excuse me, sorry. Instead of doing sets 4, 5, and 6 on the same exercise, move to an incline bench press. And this is what I think. There's no data on this because studies aren't run this way. If you move to an incline or maybe a dumbbell fly, right? Just another movement. When you do that exercise, and so you do 3 sets on one and 3 sets on the other, now there's at least potential. I can't prove this, I don't have data for it, but now there's potential that you're targeting that muscle in a different way, and perhaps you're stimulating fibers that weren't activated on the flat bench, such that you're going to get additional growth from doing the additional exercise. Um, so I would say it's better to do 3 sets on 2 different exercises than to do 6 sets on one single exercise. And when you go from flat bench, let's say it's just from flat bench to an incline bench, right? There's still redundancy between those two movements, right? So maybe it only takes 2 sets on the incline to maximize what you can get out of that exercise. But I mean, I always go for 3 or 4 just as an insurance policy to make sure I'm maxing out what I can get from that training session. But yeah, and you know, some people will go in the gym and they'll do 4 or 5 exercises for the same muscle group, right? You're training for a competition, and I'm sure you're training. I don't know wellness that well, but I know wellness is really focused on the lower body. So in a lower body session, maybe you have several exercises for your glutes. And I don't know your programming or anything, but maybe it's 3 or 4 exercises on your glutes, but you're probably training your glutes in somewhat redundant ways with exercises, and maybe I don't know how many sets it would be in a training session, but it's not all in the same exercise. Um, and
Okay,
unfortunately,
okay, can I give you a rough idea of what I do? So you
sure,
tell me if it's right or not. Okay, so because I'm almost every day doing full body,
yeah,
I just literally try to take 1 or 2 exercises that will tackle different parts of like essential muscle groups.
yeah,
So for example, today, I would do a hip thrust for like my glute maximum. For my glute medius, I would do hip abductions, and then move on to perhaps a lengthened partials sumo deadlift. So just mostly focusing on that glute activation, more so than the actual hamstrings, but hamstrings are somehow involved anyways.
yeah,
And I guess that is another question that I probably will ask you later, is accounting for muscle groups when you trying to sort of convert to the volume
yeah,
for muscle group, and like there are groups, there are exercises that are gonna cover a few different muscle groups in one. But
yeah,
I will ask you that question again later. But
yeah,
and so I will do that, and then I'll do like leg press for example, to cover quads, leg extensions, and leg curls. That would be
Okay.
kind of like my main like lower body focus, and I will just probably superset in the meantime to, well, instead of just plain waiting for resting periods, I'll just combine something with the upper body while I'm resting my lower body. So I'll do shoulder lateral raises, or like front raises, or something for rear delts, or something for back. In the meantime, my lower body recovers for the next set. So what do you think about that?
I think it sounds good. It sounds like you're employing a variety of movements, so that the glutes aren't one dimensional, and hitting those muscle groups those muscles through a variety of exercises, I think is the best approach. And I think you said you have a pretty high training frequency as well.
Yeah, 5 to 6 days a week.
Okay, okay. And this is also a point where you have to go beyond the research, right? Because what you're doing is informed by practice, it's informed by knowledge and experience. And um, as a researcher, one thing that's really important that I do is acknowledge the limitations of what we can tell people. And what you're doing doesn't exist in any randomized control trial. The ideas and theories behind what you're doing are what we can pull from and try to piece together, and more so explain why you're having success or not having success, right? So doing a variety of exercises with a high frequency, and training each muscle in a different way. So if you're doing glutes and you're doing three different exercises, I think you might have said, is it 3 or 4 sets per exercise?
Yeah, between 2 and 4, just depending
Okay.
on the muscle and like how fatigued I am. And
Yeah.
I am really connected to auto regulation. And because I have a high training frequency, I just say if I am slightly fatigued today, I'd rather just not do too much
Yeah.
and optimize what I can do well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then whatever is left, I have 5 more days to do it. So I'm not going to stress about it. I
Yeah.
still
I think
getting the
that's
volume at the end of the week.
Yeah, I think that's good. So you're providing the stimulus, and you're providing the stimulus frequently, and you're providing the stimulus to different aspects of your glutes, in the example that we're rolling with here. And, you know, i- the auto-regulation piece I think is interesting and important because you could do more, right? But it's going to hurt your recovery. And ultimately, you're trying to force muscle growth through providing a stimulus at a time when arguably, because I forget how many weeks out, you're 8 or 9 weeks out, 5 weeks out. Woo, wow, getting close. Congrats. But at this point, with the energy availability that you have, right, in the state that you're in, you're providing a stimulus, and your body's not really going to want to grow, but it's still capable of growing, right? It's the possibility is there. So you're providing that stimulus, and you're also trying to make sure that you are recovering so you can maximize the potential that some muscle growth is going to still occur, and at the very least, maintenance as your body composition comes down. Right. So there's kind of the best case, which is let's hope for some growth, which I do think is possible. I think it's been documented in a few case studies. And um, anytime when you're training, providing an increase in muscle protein synthesis and consuming protein, you'd hope that you could grow. Um, so I think your approach is sound. It makes sense to me. Um, I think what would have made less sense to me if it was 6 or 7 sets on this exercise and then move on and do 6 or 7 sets. And some people that are evidence based end up doing these things. Um, and I think they're doing them for little reason because some studies just kind of snowball and inform our recommendations way more than they should.
what are other ways of progressing overloading that have nothing to do with increasing weight or increasing sets?
I think you could just increase the intensity via um, proximity to failure, RPE, um, intensifiers. So there's so many different intensity techniques. I'm speaking today with, I think it's the individual, the gentleman that coined myoreps. So
Mm.
there's a lot of drop sets. Um, Now kind of the trending one is lengthen partials, right? So lengthen partials is thought to be a way that you can get additional volume, and ultimately, I think all of these techniques are just a way to reach the same endpoint. So when you're training a muscle, you want to fatigue activate that muscle, and so you want to get from here to here. There's so many different ways to get from here to here. You know, you could, excuse me, you could lower the weight and still have progressive overload in that, well, I trained to absolute failure even though I lowered the weight, right? So people don't think like that, but yeah, you could decrease the weight and still have progressive overload in that you're still providing a very high intensity stimulus. And when I say high intensity, I mean a close proximity to failure.
What is for you the best way to measure intensity when you compare like RIR, RPE, percentage of rep max? What is the most optimal and practical, I guess, for someone that may not know anything about the intricacies of research related to RPE, RIR, and all these terms that could be a little bit more complex for advanced trainees?
Yeah. Um, Great question. I wouldn't put my expertise as um like the RPE, the reps in reserve. I know Eric Helms and Mike Zordos have done a lot of work on in this area. Um, we typically measure it as just exertion. In research, we ask people, what was your exertion on that set? Um, I think um, I think as people become more trained, obviously they get better at gauging their intensity of their training. But one thing that I've learned is that a lot of people are just going through the motions. So when we recruit people and these people they're not resistance trained, they're new to training, we often find that they say they've maxed out, but they can do 7 more reps. Um, and that is an issue if you are training and your goal is to grow, maximize growth and these sorts of things. Um, so I think the best thing for people to do is at some point, make sure you have a proper spot, but try to train to the point where you can't do a rep anymore. And then you can gauge when you do 8 reps, you say, oh, I know I can do 10 reps with this weight, right? So you're at an 8 out of 10 or 2 reps in reserve. Um, and I saw a video of Jeff Nippard recently saying like occasionally you have to go to failure, even though it's not necessary to always go to failure. So I think maybe it's not necessary on every single lift. But if you are new to lifting and you're having a hard time gauging intensity, or you're unsure if you're gauging intensity correctly, best thing you can do is, well, train with intensity and then kind of dial it back. And I'm not saying you have to do that. I mean, squatting to failure, especially if you're using pretty heavy weights, like you want to gauge the safety of that. You want to make sure you have the proper spots and all of these sorts of things. But certainly on every machine in the gym, I think it's pretty safe to get to that point of I can't do another repetition. So I think that can be a really useful tool.
What's better when it comes to hypertrophy? Full range of motion or this new research coming out around lengthened partials?
Another great question. And this is something that my lab's been interested in. The idea came up. One of my students, I guess, was following some of the social media people that started pushing this stuff. And really early on, I was like, that's interesting. I've never heard of this before. And I started looking into the science, looking into the studies that are kind of propped up to support this. And for the listener, it's kind of being suggested online that when you train, you need to favor the lengthened position. So there's this idea that your muscle maximizes muscle growth in a stretched position, and also that the lengthened part of any range of motion is the part where you're getting the most anabolic stimulus. So in a bicep curl, it'd be at the bottom, like when your muscles lengthened. But then you take that a step further, and it would say, well, you should do bicep curls in a stretched position with your arms pulled behind you, and then favor the lengthened position. The data to support this is actually pretty weak, in my opinion. These studies that are often propped up have a non-meaningful difference between their groups. And social media influencers, in my opinion, have been very dishonest. So there will be um, a 0.1 change in muscle thickness in one group and a 0.2 change in muscle thickness in the other group. And they'll say, get 100% more growth with this new technique. What people don't realize is that difference is not meaningful. Like that difference, you can't accurately measure it with ultrasound technology. Um, and I think right now there's a lot of marketing and there's just a lot of content creation behind this idea of lengthened partials. But it's also interesting to me the line between different exercises and range of motion in the same exercise, it's all being blurred, and it's in my opinion getting messier and messier. But personally, I don't think there's compelling evidence to suggest that lengthened partials are superior to full range of motion. Mechanistically, I can't think of a reason why training when your sarcomeres have little overlap would maximize a muscle growth response. So for those that um, are less versed in muscle physiology, your sarcomere produces the force. So sarcomeres, it's called sliding filament theory, where your proteins overlap with one another, they latch on and they pool. Well, long muscle length training takes your muscle from here, it lengthens, so now there's way less overlap. So there's less actin myosin interaction. It's interesting to me that we're suggesting that when you have less overlap, you're going to stimulate more growth. Mechanistically, I would love for the people that are um, really pushing for this idea to provide some insight as to why might this be the case. I don't believe it is the case, but I would be interested if the people that are suggesting that this is the case had some, some rationale, some reasoning behind that, and I just haven't seen anything compelling so far.
Is lengthened partials similar to like focusing on the eccentric, or is just a different way to suggest um, that area that we're kind of focusing more on?
So lengthened partials, yeah, I think they've even said it's not the eccentric part, it's a concentric part that's really providing the stimulus. So being in this position where it's really not optimal for strength and then producing that force. Um, but in the research, they're doing basically a concentric and eccentric portion of the movement, but they're confining it to just along muscle lengths and then comparing it to full range of motion. Um, I will add, it's very curious to me that most of these intensifier techniques, drop sets, myo reps, none of them lead to superior growth compared to full range of motion. But all of a sudden, long muscle lengths does lead to superior growth. It's like if long muscle length leads to superior growth, drop sets would hit that same mechanism because drop sets also do more volume, also include the long muscle lengths. So the whole thing, I'm having a hard time making sense of it. But I will tell the listener, um, be open to the possibility that something's being overhyped just because it makes good content, which is kind of where I'm leaning right now.
Yeah, and I guess it's just more about using all the tools rather than just relying on one thing.
Yeah.
solely to be the best thing to
Yeah.
provoke hypertrophy and just optimize your training. And I guess it's also to add a little bit more fun to
Definitely.
the training. That's what where I see these areas more interesting, because like you get sick of doing the same sort of boring shit, straight sets, and like, well, what if I do something a little bit more challenging just to get things a little bit more interesting?
Yeah.
And especially, I don't know, in my case, because I train by myself and I design my own training programs, and I'm always like looking for ways to keep it interesting, because I have no one to talk to, and I am always showing up by myself, and it's like this gets annoying and very fatiguing sometimes. In addition, that I am already fucked up and fatigued.
Hmm.
So just looking for ways to sort of stay motivated and continue to show up in different ways that allows me to find some joy and fun in training.
Yeah.
Because at the point of contest prep, I guess, because it becomes a chore, becomes
Hmm.
something that you have to do and get your volume in and doing your resistance training sessions, it gets to a point where you actually start feeling like you're losing that passion and that
Yeah.
love for something that you used to be in love with,
Yeah.
because of that repetition and that sort of monotony of doing the same things because you gotta make it. So I guess where I see all of these techniques, they just add some extra fun and color.
I agree. I
Yeah.
think me and Holly we train together and we'll add them into our training just because it's it's a variation. Um, we like the way we get the mind muscle connection. Um, and we use it just like we use my reps, just like we use drop sets in our program, and we have fun with it. And but we'll also have debates while we're training because there's instances, for example, where I think the shortened part of the range of motion is my favorite part. And I have more mind muscle. So for me, and it's so funny because me and Holly are exact opposite on, for example, a seated hamstring curl. So on a seated hamstring curl, I'd swear that the short range of motion, like that bottom of the range of motion, I get such a muscle connection. And Holly's the opposite. For her, it's at the long muscle lengths. So this is one of those things where research for me doesn't provide anything sufficient. So what's wrong? And I've talked to Brett Contreras about this too. Like, knowing how it feels. Like, what's the mind muscle connection? What kind of pump are you getting? Like, the pump is just an indicator that you've trained with intensity because training with intensity causes a fluid shift into the muscle. Your muscle swells. Um, I I think having just some awareness of what you're doing and how it feels and having experience training can inform, okay, this seems reasonable to do. That's at least been my experience. But yeah, I completely agree with you.
Let's talk about BFR. I know you have been doing a little bit research on this. What it is and why do you use it for? What do you use it for, and what is its application?
We've done a lot of work with blood flow restriction. A lot of the early work was kind of figuring out the methodology, how to apply it in these sorts of things. And in my lab currently, we do BFR research when we have an idea that we think is really worthwhile. And the most recent study that we did was a calf study. And the idea was the calves are difficult to grow. It's kind of like this treble muscle that doesn't respond great to resistance training, for a lot of people at least. Maybe we can use BFR to get people to the point of fatigue, and maybe this will enhance muscle growth. The study didn't work, but I still thought the idea was cool. And in my mind, BFR is just another tool in the toolbox to help you fatigue and activate muscles. And one of the examples I give in my class is when I train triceps in the gym, for whatever reason, I can do, let's see, a cable, um, a cable push down. I can rep out the entire stack for infinite reps, it seems. So when you can do a lot of volume, BFR can help with that. If you now put on BFR, so for me, the triceps are always difficult to fatigue. But when I put on BFR, it's very easy for me to fatigue my triceps. And muscle growth to some extent relies on intensity and meaning you have to train with some proximity to failure. So for me, BFR is an interesting tool to help you fatigue your muscles in a more time efficient way. So if you take 30% of 1RM, you can probably do 30 to 40 reps to failure, right? And training to failure is what maximizes muscle growth, or near failure at least. With BFR, if you apply pressure to the top of your arms or legs, it's going to take that 30 or 40 reps and reduce it to 15 to 20, maybe 30 reps. But then across your sets, you're going to do way less volume. So BFR is a way to reduce the training volume necessary to elicit the same skeletal muscle growth. Now, for a healthy individual, you never need to do BFR. Where it has the most utility is someone recovering from an injury that can't lift heavy and finds that, well, I can lift light, but I have to do so many reps. It's just not efficient. If you use BFR, it now makes low load training a bit more efficient, meaning you have to do less volume to achieve the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, another question I do have about overall utility for BFR is if you were to use it for hypertrophy or as an additional tool, what is the best way to implement it or use it? Do you use it in just specific areas of your body? Where is it probably not useful or not applicable? Like you couldn't use it in your glutes, for example, or like areas that are a little bit more complicated to apply blood flow restriction. So where do you put these, I guess, these bands to impede that blood flow? And what sort of protocol would you follow in order for this to be effective?
Yeah, BFR is really only effective with the limbs, so your arms or your legs. Um, and typically, we say that the muscles being affected are the muscles distal to the cuff. So if you use BFR in the upper body, you put the cuffs at the top of your arm, and everything under that cuff is being affected, meaning, um, and I guess I'll explain how it works. When you train, you're getting arterial blood flow into your muscle, which has oxygen. And when you train, you produce metabolites, metabolic byproducts of exercise. And those metabolic byproducts are cleared. Like so they leave your muscle and they're metabolized. When you employ BFR, you inflate a cuff at the top of your arm or top of your leg. And now you've reduced that arterial blood flow into the muscle. So you've reduced the oxygen. And you've also made it so you accumulate metabolic byproducts. So when you're training and you get that burning sensation, right? Usually you're clearing those metabolites, but with BFR, you inflate that cuff, you trap them. So now you're bathing your muscle in its own metabolites. And it's actually it kind of enhances if the listener is familiar with like that muscle burn, right? From doing high reps. So you kind of get that burning sensation. And it doesn't go away when you stop training. So when you finish your set and take your rest period, typically during rest you recover and then you start your next set fresh and ready to go. But with BFR, during that rest period, it's almost more difficult because you're not contracting your muscle and you have this metabolic environment. You can't recover properly. You're getting less oxygen. So when you start your second set, you now are only going to get 10 reps and you got 30 on your first set. So across your sets, volume decreases and decreases. So since it's working through this kind of metabolite induced recruitment and fatigue, so metabolites don't seem to play a direct role in muscle growth, but they help you fatigue your muscle, which indirectly helps you grow your muscle. So the glutes are right above the cuff, right? So if you put cuffs around your legs and you train, your legs are going to fatigue very quickly with a lightweight, but your glutes are above. So I've had students ask me, can I use BFR for my glutes? And It's an interesting question. Um, if you use BFR and you do a hip thrust, here's what I expect to happen. Um, your hamstrings are going to fatigue very quickly. So this could go one of two ways. I honestly don't know the answer. This might make it so you can't keep doing hip thrust. Maybe you have to lower the weight. Um, but if your hamstrings fatigue, would you get more activation of your glutes? Possibly. I'm not sure. You might get unwanted hamstring growth, but if you kind of take your hamstrings out because they're too fatigued to contribute, maybe that would increase glute activation during a hip thrust. Um, I don't know. So this is all speculation.
Hmm.
But in general, and if people are going to use BFR, it definitely seems to have the most utility on the muscles distal to the cuff. And if you're using it, you don't need a lot of pressure. You just need enough pressure to limit venous return. And venous pressure, a lot of people don't know this. Venous pressure is very, very low. We're talking to 10 to 20 millimeters of mercury. So pressure in your veins is low. You don't need a lot of pressure. And we typically recommend doing 30 reps on your first set or shooting for 30, and then doing 3 sets of 15 following that with short rest periods of about 30 seconds. So you take really short rest because you kind of want that fatigue to carry across your sets. Because if you could keep doing 30 or 40 reps, what's the point of using the BFR? The BFR is meant to decrease the volume. Um, so 4 sets, um, to failure is a typical recommendation. But if you shoot for 30 reps and then 3 sets of 15, I think it's good to have a target kind of rep goal to just shoot for. I'm shooting for 30 reps. Hopefully, I'll get there. If I don't, I'll take my rest period and then start my second set.
This is interesting. I've never done BFR before,
Uh-huh.
but I guess it's interesting to perhaps try it at some point. I'll guess I'll give it a go at some point.
Yeah, it's very different. There's a lot of discomfort. I don't want to oversell it, but the discomfort the first few times and the soreness you'll get the first few times is going to be pretty high up there. Um, but it's something that you adapt to and you get better at. So it's definitely something to try. We throw it in our training every once in a while, and you will finish 4 sets, and you'll say that muscle doesn't need to be trained anymore today. It's done. So it's a really effective technique.
How to best manage training fatigue?
That's a good question, and I struggle with this one because I struggle on some level. What is fatigue?
Mhm.
Um, and we wrote a paper where we tried to get to the bottom of it to some extent because um, you hear a lot of these training models that it's like stimulus fatigue ratio. I think is pretty popular. Um, I that model for me falls flat because nobody seems to know when they say fatigue accumulates. Nobody has vocalized, at least that I can find, what's accumulating. So I listened to this like 2-part podcast one time. I won't say which one, but they talked about fatigue accumulation for like 2 hours. And every time they mentioned what was accumulating, they just called it fatigue. They never defined it as anything. And I'm like, well, what accumulates? And they say, well, fatigue accumulates. I was like, yeah, but what is the fatigue? And it's interesting because fatigue is typically defined as the accumulation of something or the depletion of something, right? So when you train, you deplete ATP. ATP is resynthesized very quick. When you train, you deplete muscle glycogen. Muscle glycogen is typically also replenished. We don't deplete our fat stores, except, those in prep who decrease the amount of fat quite a bit, but we don't deplete our fat stores. So there's the depletion hypothesis. You can deplete ADP PCR to some extent. These are all acute things. The other hypothesis is an accumulation. So when you look at training, what do you accumulate? Well, when you're training, you accumulate hydrogen ions, you accumulate lactic acid, And these things stop you from doing your set, right? You get to rep 13, you're like, I can't do another rep. You stop that rep because you've accumulated metabolic byproducts and you've depleted your ATP PCR. You need to replenish it for your next set. Um, None of these mechanisms of fatigue are very long lasting. So you replenish your glycogen, you replenish your ATP PCR, you clear your lactate, your blood pH goes back to normal. So does fatigue actually accumulate? And this is where um, I think it's interesting just to think about, okay, why do I feel fatigued and what is this sensation that I'm experiencing? My training volumes not going in the right direction. And I don't have a perfect answer for this, but I at least think that some of it um, is just muscle damage kind of being confused with fatigue. So I think a lot of when people say I've accumulated fatigue, I think it's muscle damage because muscle damage has to you have to remodel muscle, right? Um, and if you consistently lift heavy and lift with intensity, there's a good chance that you're inducing muscle damage. Now, as you become more trained, your muscle protects you from that damage. So the more trained you become, the better you get at not experiencing high levels of muscle damage moving forward. So even muscle damage, I would say, doesn't appear to accumulate across time. It actually lessens across time because you reinforce your muscle, you remodel your muscle to be more robust to handle that stimulus. So that leaves, I think, other life stressors, right? So you have the recovery um, of the actual muscle tissue, but then there's your life outside of just training. There's sleep, there's diet, there's stress. And I think for a lot of folks, it's the culmination of all of these things that truly lead to fatigue. And I think that fatigue, I think we just like to sometimes blame our training, right? Whereas, okay, our training, yes, but it's actually our recovery and our diet and our sleep. And maybe if those things were optimized, the training wouldn't be an issue. But then now the training seems like an issue because of everything else. Um, so I I don't have I know I got far from the original question, but hopefully there was something useful in there. I say all this to say, um, our muscle seems robustly capable of adapting to stimulus and adapting to stress. And um, even when you look at the overtraining literature, this is not something that's easy to accomplish. It's not easy to overtrain. And when overtraining does occur, I believe it's largely due to life more globally than just the gym, if that makes sense.
I have a question, and it's more so something that I think it sort of goes along what you say in terms of defining fatigue and how something that you seem to feel like is limiting a like continuing or extending a set, for example, of X amount of reps. I have experienced that when I'm doing a set and I am doing the reps kind of like regularly, like on a momentum, and like I'm not pausing and I'm just like doing one after the other, fatigue is going to accumulate very fast.
Hmm.
And I am going to start feeling like I'm getting closer to failure much quicker.
Yeah.
But interesting enough, with this prep and the amount of very little energy I have,
Hmm.
when I am doing something that I want to intentionally train and, and aim for relatively still heavy weights, I'm somehow experiencing that I can still do a relatively good set
Hmm.
if I pause when I am feeling like I'm going to get really fatigued.
Hmm.
Let's say I pause for 3 seconds or 5 seconds,
Hmm.
and then I continue. and somehow it kind of allows me to reset a little bit my strength, and then I
Hmm.
can keep going. And sometimes just by doing this a few times in the latest reps closer to failure, I can actually do more reps. And it seems weird because if I don't do these reps, I sort of like stay stuck at 10 or 12 reps. But
Hmm.
sometimes if I just do these little pauses in between reps, it allows me to get to at least to get 7 or 8 more reps, which
Okay.
seems a bit contradictory. What could be causing that response that is allowing me to do more? But if
Yeah.
I don't add these little pauses, I get to failure much quicker.
So, in your example, are you kind of getting to failure and then you're getting an additional number of reps through pausing? So, let's say 8, 9, 10, and then you pause. You get another one, and then you pause and you get another one. Is that kind of what you're expressing? So this would kind of be beyond failure, beyond, classic failure of just not being able to complete another repetition. And it sounds like what you're allowing is brief recovery, right? So be that from, you know, you never really truly deplete ADP as I understand. Yeah, I mean um you can deplete it. Like I've seen studies where they show it slump down, but as soon as you use ATP, you're working on resynthesizing that ATP. So it might give a brief moment to resynthesize more ATP and replenish some of that immediate energy system that's necessary for contraction. It may also provide um, the opening of blood flow. So when you contract your muscle, you create occlusion. So much like BFR. So BFR is a form of occlusion. You're inflating a cuff, and that cuff is stopping blood flow to the muscle, or making sure blood can't leave the muscle as well. When you contract your muscle does the same thing, right? So when you do a leg press, for example, you're pushing that leg press up. When you're pushing that leg press up, your muscle is squeezing your vasculature and it shoots your blood pressure up, right? Because your blood flow to your legs is now cut off, which it increases something called peripheral resistance dramatically. So blood pressure gets up to 400 to 500 millimeters of mercury during the concentric portion of a leg press for some individuals, which I think is just wildly impressive. Um, but anyway, when you pause, it also allows for blood flow. So, like when you're doing a leg press, limited blood flow because the muscle's contracting. If you take a brief moment to relax, you're going to open up the vasculature, decrease that peripheral resistance, allow oxygenated blood in, allow brief clearance of some of those metabolites. If you do that, you're going to be able to, get another rep and then do it again. And okay, and now allow another rep because it's like brief moments of recovery. Does that help explain it? I
Yeah.
don't know that I'm right, but that's what I would speculate is explaining this phenomenon.
Would that mean that I'm not training hard enough if I were to stop and not do these pulse mini recoveries like
Not at all.
reps?
Not at all. I mean, you're training harder when you do this, but I would consider this an intensifier technique,
Okay.
right? So maybe this intensifier technique makes it such that maybe if you do 2 sets this way, it's the same as doing 4 sets without doing it. Like I don't know. I'm trying to math it in my head of what it might equate to. But just like, you know, I don't think most people are doing 4 sets of myo reps. They're probably doing a myo rep set where there's 4 sets in this, 4 sets in 1 set. You don't need to do it 4 times. It's like doing
Mm-hmm.
16 sets. So this intensifier technique, since it's taking you beyond classic traditional failure, maybe you don't have to do another one at all. Or maybe like 2 is as good as 4. Um, Maybe with less overall sets. It just sounds like an efficiency thing to me, honestly.
and the other thing that I'm experiencing is a bit weird because sometimes I'm like I have experienced this mostly when with leg exercises, and I've been doing a little bit more experimentation with like the hack squat.
Hmm.
But something that I've been realizing is that usually the first set I feel super weak,
Hmm.
and I guess this part of like the kind of getting into the movement and warming up the muscles and sort of like getting connected to the movement pattern and everything. The second set, even this is after having done some warm-up sets leading up to my working weight.
Hmm.
The second set feels easier than the first set.
Hmm.
And I am sort of progressively increasing the weight a little bit more for each set that I am moving towards.
Uh-huh.
So it feels weird to me that sometimes I've gotten to my highest set with my highest weight,
Hmm.
and it's the set where I can actually get the most reps.
Yeah.
So it's just very strange. I do the first set, and let's say I'm doing with 50 kilos, and I get to do 15 reps.
Hmm.
The second set, I still aim for that 15 reps, just with more weight.
Hmm.
And it seems like I get to failure at 12, but I do
Hmm.
these pauses and I still get to 15.
Yeah.
Then I go to 70 kilos and I might still get to 12 reps as my top number of reps that I can get continuing. But I do these waiting mini periods and then somehow I get to 18 or 20 reps. It's just
Hmm.
mind blowing. I don't understand.
Yeah.
Why is this happening? Even though I am increasing the weight, I should be
Yeah.
doing less. Sometimes I feel like, am I training weirdly or not hard enough in my first sets that with the highest weight, I can still reach more reps?
Hmm.
Or is it something connected to the fact that, well, this is my last rep, my last set. Let's do
Yeah.
everything that I have.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I also don't know. It would be interesting if you log it to just start at whatever you did on your last set and then see how that looks across sets. Because what you might see if you started at 70, right? Maybe you'd see this across sets instead. Um, so it could be like a warm-up thing or a perceived intensity thing. Another possibility, it doesn't explain everything you just detailed, but maybe some of it is strength and endurance strength are not a perfect relationship, meaning um and I think I experienced this to some extent where 12 reps feels about the same with multiple different weights. Or like beyond a certain number of reps, my fatigue curve just drops off and I fatigue very rapidly. Um, and what that means for me is it feels pretty intense with a certain weight, but I can increase the weight and probably have that same intensity with a pretty similar number of reps. And this is not perfect science, but again, the your strength and your endurance both contribute to your ability to do a hypertrophic set because if you're lifting relatively heavy, you're also doing it with as many reps as you can. And especially like uh, maybe I don't know. I'm getting in a weird area here, but if you're type 2 dominant, maybe like your fatigue characteristics are just tricky with different weights across sets. But either way, I would be curious if you start with your what you do on your last set, how that goes, and maybe you're just not warmed up and ready to do that weight. Maybe you have to gradually get there um, to increase blood flow and activation of your motor unit. Some maybe part of it is just this kind of more elaborate warm up thing. But you also said you train alone, and sometimes it's that training partner that wakes you up to wait. You're doing that weight? I can do that weight, right? Because you kind of show yourself you can do that weight for that many reps. Um, so I don't know how to explain that one. perfectly, but I do think it wouldn't hurt to try the opposite way and see how it goes.
I always I'm logging everything that I'm doing,
Yeah.
and that's why I've noticed that pattern,
Yeah.
especially because that is the first exercise I prioritize
Hmm.
as my first exercise of the entire training session. And
Hmm.
so I'm the fresher, but
Yeah.
my always I kind of always start conservative because I feel weak.
Uh,
And it's like something mentally like I am today, I don't have much energy. I just see
yeah.
how I go. So after my sort of I start with like 2 plates of 10, and then I start adding weight until I decide, well, this is going to be my first working set. And I've
Yeah.
done like 3 mini sets already of warming up. But
Hmm.
even on that first warm up set, which I find that I still try to be conservative, but not
Yeah.
so conservative, I fatigued way more than in my last set. That even though I have increased to
Yeah.
my top maximum weight, I get this extra amount of reps that sometimes like, what the fuck? I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't understand why.
So there could be maybe there's a sympathetic component here where, you know, because I'm getting at way outside my area, but I'll speculate a little bit. Because of the energy state that you're in, you know, maybe your body is just trying to remain in a relaxed state, a more parasympathetic state. So maybe, when you look at the sympathetic response to exercise, the normal response is you anticipate exercise. Your heart rate starts increasing before you even touch those weights, right? And they've shown this in research that it'll be people at the beginning of a race and their heart rate gets to 90% of what's necessary to do that race before they even moved. So I'm not familiar with research in this area. So again, speculation, but I wonder, being 5 weeks out from a show, is there some type of protective mechanism that's like, you know what, we're just in preservation mode. We're not going to let Astrid just ramp everything up to 100 and go out in the gym. Maybe that ramp becomes longer when you're in this state. This might be a podcast to have like Luisa um, Nicola on her.
Okay.
Someone that does the mind stuff because there could be something there. I can't speak to it. It's too far out of my expertise. I could ramble for 2 hours on potential things, but
Yeah.
I got to be
Oh,
careful not to do that.
yeah. Now, not sure how much of deloads you have worked on, but what is the best protocol for a deload? And are these beneficial for those who struggle with chronic fatigue?
I definitely think deloads have a place. Um, and I, I I don't know if we've done a good job of studying them. So a deload, obviously, when you're going through a training block, or writing your programming, I think it's important to have some type of planned rest. Um, and I think as far as managing fatigue, you would want some type of biomarker to track to indicate that a deload is necessary. Um, and some people even think deloads resensitize your muscle, like for muscle growth, meaning if you take a break, you're going to come back and you're going to grow a whole lot more. Um, all of these things are interesting. And if I can lean on the most recent study that was published, because this study, it went, I mean, it went as viral as research can go, because there was popular people on the paper. But the most recent paper was like, does muscle resensitization happen from a deload? And I read this study, and man, it has everybody saying like, so the social media takeaway from the recent paper on deloads is that deloads do not resensitize your muscles for muscle growth. That's the social media headline. When you read the paper, this is exactly what they did in the paper, Astrid. They had people train their lower body for 9 weeks, twice a week. So that's 18 sessions. The deload group took a week off in the middle and they measured muscle growth pre and post. And guess what? They were the same pre and post. Um, and this is why I love breaking down research because this study's been talked about so much. And it was 16 lower body sessions versus 18 lower body sessions. With the tools of measurement that we have, there's no chance you're going to measure a difference when interpreting the study. Um, and I would argue it wasn't even a deload because if you take 2 sessions off in the middle, but you didn't need 2 sessions off, why did you take 2 sessions off? So that was my main critique of that study. Why are we taking a quote deload if there's no reason to? Um, and maybe, I mean, you're a coach, so you have more experience than I do. And I talk with Holly about these things as well. But um, if you don't need a deload, I think it's okay to keep training. If there's no signs of things are moving in the wrong direction, let's keep going. And, you have other tools to manage stress. You can change the training loads because it's probably a good idea not to lift heavy all the time. Low load training still grows muscle, so we can lift with low loads. Um, and you can use other intensifier techniques to decrease your volume, which maybe decreasing volume is sometimes necessary. Um, so people that like, I think a lot of people are scared of taking a deload because they don't want to lose adaptation. We have so much data that taking a week off training, a couple of weeks off training, you're going to come back and you're going to be right back to where you were pretty quickly. In fact, I think there's an Agasawa study that takes multiple weeks off, and over the course of a 6-month training study, they have the same muscle growth in both groups. So periodic periods of detraining aren't going to get you off the path of muscle growth in a horrible way. Now, for someone like you that's training for a competition that relies on muscle growth with low body fat percentage, um, it's probably more important to be very intentional and strategic with these things. And, not take 2 weeks off training. I doubt that's something you'd be willing to do right now. Um, but I definitely think deloads are an important part of training. But I also think that you don't need to take a deload just for the sake of taking a deload.
Can you maintain or gain strength as you lose weight? Or is it more like the relative strength compared to your body weight? Because one very interesting phenomenon I have noticed is that my weight, even though that I've lost about 13 kilos, I feel like relative to my body weight, like when I do body weight stuff, let's say pull-ups, I
Mhm.
have gotten stronger, but because I weigh less, it
Yeah.
feels like it's much easier to do 10, 12 reps that I was never ever able to do when I was 72 kilos.
Mhm.
So, but I was able to train with my weight at 72 kilos. And as I've lost weight, I've been able to increase the capacity to reach more reps in a much more efficient way. Would that mean that I still relatively strong enough as when I was 72 kilos, or I have gotten stronger relative to my body weight?
Well, it's tough to gauge strength on a body weight scale when you're losing weight, right? Because, you know, technically the absolute load you're lifting is less. But your relative strength has gone up. And I think that's a great thing. Like that's an indication that you're recovering well, right? And if your strength is still there, I think that's great. I think absolute strength is also interesting to track in these scenarios. And there's some lifts that rely on leverages. So you're having more body weight behind you, I think is simply going to be a benefit. Um, but there's multiple instances, even within the literature, that you can lose weight. You can even lose muscle and gain strength. And I found this really interesting early on. And it kind of ties back to the first thing we talked about, which was muscle growth and muscle strength and these adaptations not having a perfect relationship. And what you see in some studies, and this comes from the periodization literature, people will do a hypertrophy phase. So 8 weeks of hypertrophy training, or in research, it's probably 4 weeks. Um, and then if you enter a strength phase, sometimes, not always, but sometimes during that strength phase, you lose the muscle growth that you gained in the growth phase. And that's why some people came up with undulating periodization, because they said, we want to maintain the muscle growth throughout all of the phases. So we need to throw in a muscle hypertrophy day. But anyway, in these studies, they would enter the strength phase, lose the muscle growth from the growth phase by the end of the strength phase, but still be stronger at the end of the strength phase than they were at the beginning of the strength phase. So this is a very interesting scenario where strength increases, but muscle size decreases, which I find fascinating. So that's been documented. So certainly, if you can lose muscle and gain strength, then you can lose body fat and gain strength. I definitely think that's the case.
And when do you know that you're losing strength, or whether it's mainly fatigue that is happening that is hurting your lifts? How can you differentiate? Am I losing actual muscle, or
Mhm.
am I just fatigued or not
That's a tough
recovering
one.
enough? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I don't know that I have a great answer. And there's in the literature, there's different tools that are more sensitive to these things. So, for example, a isometric mid thigh pull and a vertical jump are thought to be very sensitive measures that start decreasing before you're overtraining. So it's like, I mean, realistically, who has access to a mid thigh pull? It's like for those that don't know, it's like doing a deadlift, but the bar starts at your mid thigh and it doesn't move. So you just pull on the bar and you measure your force. That will start decreasing before there's signs of overtraining. But probably the way to tell if you've lost strength is like a maladaptation, or if you're just fatigued, is, are there other signs of like overtraining, right? So um has sleep been um not normal, right? As have other things in your life been such that just there's evidence that recovery is not there? Are the muscles sore? Is there swelling? Is there inflammation? So I don't, and maybe it's because I haven't thought about this a whole lot, but I don't have a perfect answer. But I would assume it would be based on, are there other signs and evidence that this is fatigue and not just a temporary maladaptation? So it's not uncommon to experience muscle atrophy, and just like muscles grow and they shrink, they atrophy. Strength also increases and decreases. But I think strength is a little bit easier to hold on to. So even if it does decrease, I believe it will come back. And it could even be a protective mechanism, right? I think our body has a lot of protective mechanisms. And, what competition, especially physique competition, you know, you're providing your body less resource. It probably wants to protect you. And part of protecting you might be decreasing your strength to prevent you from exerting, right?
Hmm.
So I don't know, just some thoughts. Not a perfect answer.
Overtraining a thing or overreaching? Or are they same or different things?
Well, they're related, because overreaching is this idea that you're coming really close to overtraining, but you want to pull back just in time to achieve supercompensation.
Hmm.
And none of this has been proven. It's thought to occur. I consider it more of a strength and conditioning kind of philosophy. Um, and powerlifters will use it, but physiologically, there's not a good explanation for what supercompensation is. Supercompensation makes sense for like glycogen. If you deplete glycogen, you can come back with more. But like, you don't have to deplete your strength to be stronger. And you certainly, like, muscle growth doesn't have supercompensation, because that would imply you have to get smaller muscles to get bigger muscles, right? So supercompensation is ultimately the concept that's connected to that. And that one's a tough one to that's a tough sell for me. But they
And
are related in just a pattern of performance drops off, then you pull back, try to recover, and reveal the adaptations that you've actually made, which maybe post show is something that you'll try to experience. You'll see, okay, how much does my strength increase when I return to normal energy levels and all of these things.
can you build some muscle with some types of cardio?
Um, Cardio muscle gain, yeah. I mean, it's obviously not the most ideal way to grow a muscle.
Hmm.
And maybe I can give the extreme example of cardio resistance training. My dissertation used 15% of 1RM. So 15% of 1RM, like it was a bicep curl. So if some people were lifting like 1.2 pound dumbbells, and we had to tape dumbbells together to make them weigh that little. So basically, when the intensity gets below a certain point, you can do infinite contractions. Not infinite, but theoretically somewhat infinite. And if the contractions go longer than 3 minutes, there's evidence to suggest you're no longer stimulating muscle protein synthesis of the myofibers. You're stimulating mitochondrial biogenesis, and you're stimulating more aerobic type adaptations. But nonetheless, there are studies that show that doing aerobic exercise does grow muscle. It's nowhere near as robust as lifting weights. I think cycling probably has the most efficacy, particularly when you cycle at higher wattages. Good potential for growth there. And then there's been studies where they put BFR on in combination with walking or riding a bike, and then you get pretty robust growth. Probably still not ideal, but it all comes down to um, the intensity of the movement. And essentially, I think of aerobic exercise as kind of uninterrupted blood flow. So you have oxygenated blood continuing to get to the muscle. And the muscle's contracting, but the muscle's not contracting hard enough to cut off blood flow, such that you'll fatigue your muscle in, the 15 or 20 seconds that you do with resistance exercise. And
Yep.
for that reason, it just isn't providing a maximal stimulus like resistance training.
I love that. Well, Sam, I loved our conversation. It actually went longer than I thought it would be.
And
So
we could have kept going, so that's good.
it was really awesome just to ask you also like practical questions of my experiences lifting strangely. But I loved that we were able to cover quite a lot of questions around hypertrophy, strength, fatigue, and all of these little points that I think they're great for us to dig a little bit deeper. And I think we did go that
Yeah,
to that
yeah, I think
level.
so
So
too.
I appreciate you.
Appreciate you too, and thank you so much for having me on.
It's a pleasure. Have a good day.
You too.